We're going to get started with Leslie this evening with a few remarks, and then take over from John, and make sure you have your questions ready. So, Leslie?
Thanks a lot, Terry. So why should you care? You need to care about transit in Toronto. I think it's really the first thing I wanted to make sure you understand. Not that you don't care. The fact that you're here on this full winter day indicates to me there's a lot of care in this room. I think what I'd like to say in terms of this whole topic and the future of transit and mobility in the region is if we don't do anything, the congestion that we will experience will basically drive our economy down. It will cause a decline in the environment, and it will totally diminish our quality of life. And you here can be part of the solution. We at Metrolinx, we have a plan. It's underway, and we need your help to help us advance it. So tonight, I'm just going to very quickly talk about the problem, the solution, and how organizations like yourselves can help. So our system is straining from a lot of, the reason we've gotten to where we are, it's important to think about how we got to where we are. First of all, there's some really good things happening in this region. We are a growing region. The forecasts say that by 2031 there are going to be 3 million more people here, living here, which means it's got great things for our economy, but it also comes with challenges. That's about 100,000 people a year coming to this region. Coupled with that, the fact that over the last 15 to 20 years, we stopped investing in transit and transportation. So we have the double whammy, catch up and grow simultaneously. So that's a really, really tough challenge. Congestion, and we all experience it, no matter which part of this region you live in. It's costing us $6 billion a year, and we're losing. The estimate is about 26,000 jobs a year as a result of congestion. So this is really, we're seeing a decline in productivity, our competitiveness is on the line, and our ability to attract and retain jobs is definitely problematic. We have, as a result of not having invested in transit, the urban sprawl that we see experiencing throughout the outer regions of Toronto and the GTA is also contributing, because the idea of living and working close together, which is one of the more ideal, kind of complete ideas about the quality of life, it's being eroded, and we have to kind of draw that back. And transit is a key to that. And finally, of course, the more people and more dependency on the automobile means we are also, as a result, pouring more pollutants into the environment, even with the advances of the automobile and more electric vehicles and so forth. So that's sort of how did we get here? Well, we sort of forgot about the importance of mobility, and we forgot and we didn't have the commitment, I would say, politically and the leadership to understand that there was this wave coming and that we didn't anticipate it and we didn't think about it. So we find ourselves at this time. But in many respects, all is not lost. At Metrolinx, we have a plan. We have a plan that was developed in 2008. It was bought into, unanimously adopted by the board at the time, all representatives from the elected leadership across this region. That was not an easy task. But it also the plan itself was comprehensive in its approach in trying to address not just the infrastructure, but all the other aspects of our plan. And it focused very much on how to begin to deliver on the plan. It's a blueprint for a more sustainable transportation, and it's a vision that we think will result, we know because we've done the math, will result in seamless multimodal transportation in this region, and it is what we need. So it's already, the plan is not just a piece of paper sitting around on the shelf. We've already begun implementing. In fact, there's $16 billion worth of investment that's committed to this plan. Over 200 projects underway. We try to make sure that everyone knows that they're actually real projects. Infrastructure in general takes very long to build, and so it's difficult to see the actual product immediately, but you should know there's 4 light rapid transit projects that are underway, including the Eglinton Crosstown. GO Transit itself is expanding, and places like Union Station revitalization, what the improvements we're making to the Georgetown corridor, the adding in of new service, enabling more people to move around more easily. And of course, we are introducing the Union Pearson Express, which will connect the downtown Toronto to the airport, opening in 2015. And of course, the subway expansion up to Vaughan Corporate Center is the first subway expansion in over 30 years, and it will connect two municipalities, two regions, and make a significant difference to folks in particular if you're a resident in York Region or a student at York University. So we've got $16 billion already committed. Projects are underway. Lots of details around how that gets done. But we know that we can't afford to end up in the same place we were 15 or 20 years ago, which is resting on our laurels and just sitting here. We need to make sure that we've got the next stream of projects and the next wave of projects and the next wave of investment ready to go, because these things take a while. By the time you do the sort of detailed planning, do the environmental assessments, get the community, all the approvals along, get a shovel in the ground. It's not a fast, speedy process. So we have identified in our next wave of investment a series of projects that includes 2 new subway lines, including what we refer to as the connecting subway line between, that's referred to sometimes as the downtown relief line, and as well as a new extension of the Yonge subway north to Richmond Hill. We've also identified a new bus rapid transit corridors in Halton, Peel, Toronto, and Durham. And those are dedicated right-of-ways for more rapid buses. We've also identified what we refer to as Go two-way all day. So if any of you use the Go service, we have really good peak at rush hour service. But if you have a meeting at 2 in the afternoon and you want to get out, you live in Oakville, you want to get to the meeting and back, it's very difficult because we don't have all-day service. And that's a major transformation of Go from just a commuter rail to a real regional rail service. And that, we think, is very important. In addition to rapid transit at Metrolinx, we talk about the new wave having to include 25% of the investment going towards local transportation priorities. So it's about 50% of that. 5% going towards regional roads, so things like HOV lanes, high occupancy vehicle lanes. And then another 5% to the less expensive but much more impactful initiatives such as active transportation, so walking, cycling, wayfinding, intelligent transportation systems that help you get to where you want to go, and information on your BlackBerry and your smartphone. So these are things we're looking ahead within the plan that we've outlined, and we've got that laid out. But in order to get to this point, it's now part what we're calling to have the big conversation. Because so we've gotten to the point where we have a plan, we've started building, we know what are the next steps we have to do, and now we have to figure out how we're going to pay for the next wave. And we know, and we've been looking at other jurisdictions, Chicago, London, Montreal, Los Angeles, trying to really understand what is the best approach to sustainable funding for transit and transportation in this region. Because if there's one thing we've learned, there's no formula of what fits for what area. You really have to customize it to your needs within your region. And so we have begun a whole series of public meetings around asking that very question. What is it that, and how can we generate more revenue? We are required under our legislation to present to the province of Ontario at 1st of June of this year an investment strategy that lays out how we're going to do that. So as part of that conversation, and I brought a couple kind of props with me tonight. Anybody who would like, you've just come and asked me. We have what we call a conversation kit. We've created a package where anyone in your community, in your neighborhood, in your groups, it's got little play cards, well, they're not play cards, cards about all the projects. They're like cards, they're kind of cool. It's got the maps, it's got all the information from other jurisdictions, and then we've got a stack of cards which we call the big conversation or the big questions. And they're meant to be for you, for individuals, groups, to take it within, it could be in your neighborhood or whatever, to really help us sort of shape what we want to do. So we're asking the questions, We invite you to attend some of our public roundtables. We're on Facebook, Twitter, all those other means. And really happy to be here to begin to hear as well ideas others have about how to break this jam. Over to you.
Leslie, thank you. And I didn't bring thank you. Let's have a round of applause. I don't know. Very unfair. I have no props. But, and I said to Leslie before we started that she would be, as she was, the consummate professional public servant and would convey a lot of interesting information about the plans and so forth. I'm not going to be political in the context of our moderator having said that we shouldn't talk about people and their views and so forth, but I am going to talk about what I think is a political problem that we represent, we meaning collectively represent the solution to that problem, but we're going to have to become more activists. And I'm heartened by the fact there are this many people who would come out, as was said, on a cold January night to talk about this. I mean, Leslie said it very well. I'm struck by the fact that my first political activism was in the late 1960s, and the first person I really worked for in earnest was Premier Bill Davis. And in 1971, he canceled the Spadina Expressway and said at that time, in 1971, that cities are for people, not cars. And he announced on the day he canceled the Spadina Expressway that there would be built down the sort of spine of the city and underground through the spine of the city at the Spadina subway. Now, why am I talking about this? Well, I was in the Spadina subway at the St. Clair West Station about a week ago, and I noticed a plaque there that talked about the day that the Spadina subway opened. And it was 1978. And I'm thinking to myself, isn't that remarkable that Premier Davis could have canceled the Spadina Expressway, they could have got the money and everything else and the plans organized, and then built and opened that subway that today, of course, we accept as a part of our life in the city in 7 years. And Leslie just talked about the fact through political neglect, through various things, including, I will say, improved environmental assessment and things like that we didn't used to do in those kinds of days. But nonetheless, today we would be lucky to have anything built if we decided today it's 17 years from today, as opposed to 7 years. And I think that's a big part of the problem. And I want to talk about why. She set out, Leslie did, all the different considerations. And I'll just mention the headlines that I had here because I won't repeat it. I mean, there are human considerations. People spending massive amounts of time away from their families and away from their children. There are health implications to the congestion problem and to the lack of proper public transportation. And I use the word transportation because it isn't just about transit, as Leslie herself said. It's more than transportation. People are going to drive cars and trucks. They have to in a big urban area like this. There are social reasons. I mean, I've made it a big part of my life as a private citizen in charitable work, but also when I was a politician, to try to learn about and to be activist on the subject of our priority neighborhoods, which we so politely call them in this city, the priority neighborhoods where tens of thousands of people live in a marginalized, fairly isolated way. Well, part of the purpose of the transit plan that was put forward in the city and outside the city was to make sure people who lived in those neighborhoods, which unusually in North American cities tend to be suburban, in our case, was to give them access to opportunity by proper public transportation that could get them to work. There are environmental considerations that Leslie mentioned, economic considerations, which she mentioned as well. So you might say to yourself, well, if that's all true, and if this ranks, as it consistently does now, at the top of the opinion polls as to the major issue, local issue, that people would name in the Greater Toronto area, why is it not moving forward? Why have we had decades of neglect? And this is the part where I'm just going to be candid and hopefully stimulate some discussion. I think it is because there has been a complete lack of will on the part of political leaders of all stripes over all periods of time to actually do anything about this. And I have been a politician, so I understand the difficulties of some of these issues I'm going to briefly discuss and then turn it over to you for a more open discussion. I think in some respects, while they have been afraid to make the big decisions, especially as regards where you build transit, when and how you pay for it, more importantly than perhaps the other two, because if you can't pay for it, it doesn't matter what the plans say. There's been too much political involvement on the other side. So you've seen situations, and I don't associate you with any of these comments, and I'll stand here and say that you had nothing to say about any of this. You just sat here absolutely without any betrayal of opinion on your face at all. But the bottom line is we had way too much political involvement in deciding the sort of the wheres and the whens of transit being built. I'll be candid in saying, and I went to York University, I went to law school there, but that subway should not have been built ahead of a downtown relief line. And that's not because you're trying to sort of favor the downtown. It is simply because if you look at where the need is and the overcapacity or the undercapacity of our transit system at the moment, you look at people missing 5 or 6 trains, you know, at a single visit on a platform, That is where the need was. But politics came into it, and a subway was built to York. And it'll be super when it's done, and everybody who goes to York, of which there are 40,000 students, will be very happy, and it connects Vaughan, and there's a lot of firsts that are very happy. Secondly, the financing has been the same way. I mean, the financing has been subject to people's political timetables of all parties at all levels of government over a long period of time, as opposed to being based on any kind of rational decision-making that would say you're going to build the transit when you need it, where you need it. So some projects get financed because it's election year, other projects don't get financed. The federal government's in one and not in the other. The provincial government's in one for a certain amount and not the other. And it goes on and on and on. I don't know what the solution to this is, because I think what we want is the accountability of our elected officials being involved in making these decisions, but what you don't want is what we've now seen for probably the last 20 years, which is this kind of helter-skelter, ad hoc, very politically motivated series of decisions about where the transit is built and who's paying for it at any given point in time. I would say that what we need now is a plan, and I'm gratified to say, and I speak a lot about this as the head of Civic Action. Which is a nonpartisan group, so I don't speak for or against any party or for or against any particular person who's in municipal office or anywhere else. I just speak in favor of a plan that they've worked hard on, that they've built consensus around, that I think answers not every single need, but answers a large part of the need to have a regional plan that is going to set out priorities and get on with doing it. I think we need some kind of a strengthened regional authority. Metrolinx is a good start in that regard. Metrolinx, the best thing they did, and I even got Hazel McCallion to agree with me on this, is take the politicians off the board of Metrolinx, because when you have politicians there, I've been one, as I say again, they can't help themselves. They can't help themselves but to grandstand and to make decisions and say things based on what they think is going to curry favor with whoever votes for them, as opposed to doing what is in the broader public interest. And I think we need to get organizations like Metrolinx that have more authority and are as disconnected from politics as they possibly can be. And then it comes down to the hard part. That part's easy. That's process and it's structure and it's this and it's that. I think the hard part is going to be to engage people. It's this kind of big conversation that Leslie referred to, and you are so much a part of that. And while you're here at meetings like this, and I wasn't familiar with this organization before I was asked to come and speak, but there are organizations like this where people genuinely do care. But I think the difference has been, and maybe it's because people have kind of lost faith in the political process, which I deeply regret, because I've been involved in it for 44 years, since I was 14 years old. And I really believe in it as a positive force for change. But I think people have kind of given up on it for some of the reasons I mentioned earlier, in terms of cynicism and inefficacy and so on. But I think you've got to re-engage in the political process and force onto the table an honest discussion about a couple of things. First of all, I mean, the honest discussion has to focus on what the real needs are. I think a lot of that has been done in that we have a plan now that is based on what people see as the real needs, but you've got to keep the politics out of it and make sure that if you need a downtown relief line, because that's what's going to help people move in and out of the city, and that's where the undercapacity is at the moment, that's what you build first, and that you do that because it's the right thing to do. The second thing is we're going to have an honest discussion about the possibility for some radical solutions. I think we far too often reject things before we even open up our minds to considering them. I'll name one that is not a transit project, but it's the Gardiner Expressway. And I've changed my mind on this, because I've changed my mind on a couple of things. I'm going to make an honest admission about a second one in a moment. But I've changed my mind about the Gardiner in that I thought before we just couldn't afford to sort of really look at the widest range of options, including tearing it down, burying it, and things like that. And I'm now thinking to myself, if we're thinking ahead, I have 2 grandchildren now, and I'm thinking ahead to their life in this city, which I think of, by the way, as the greatest place in the world in which to live, notwithstanding our flaws, then wouldn't you take an honest look at tearing it down or burying it or whatever, and even if the cost is huge, you'd say to yourself, it's an investment we're going to make in something that's going to make this a much greater city and is going to allow transportation generally to be improved. And we're going to have to consider those radical solutions. Look, I even said something that 99% of you, I'm sure, in this room won't like, but I'd say, look, I won't rule it out before anybody's even considered it, which is to say, if we're going to consider private sector involvement in getting some of this stuff done, then wouldn't you even open your mind to saying, well, look, let's ask the private sector, how would you participate in building and operating this transit, even to the point where you say, fine, if it means getting a downtown relief line done in the foreseeable future before I'm dead, then I'd even consider saying, look, you come in and give us your proposal as to how you'll build it and operate it, and you'll operate it subject to regulation, and the fares will have to be consistent with what the fares are elsewhere. I'm not really in favor of that. It's not my favorite option at all, but I'd say, well, look, I certainly want to consider somebody making a proposal to say, I'll darn well get this thing built, rather than just saying we're ruling all those things out. And that's why I'd say about the Gardiner. Invite anybody in and say, look, what would you do to do this at the minimum possible cost. And what changed my mind on the Gardiner was simply the fact that they said, what, 3 or 4 weeks ago, we're going to invest $500 million in repairing it, kind of a cut and paste job on the thing. And you say to yourself, does that make any sense at all as a long-term investment and something that will stand the test of time for my grandchildren? And by the way, I'll make the other admission, because it relates to my final point, which is we've really got to have, and this is the one that's going to require the most honesty and the most courage, and it's the one I'm most worried about and the one that I speak about most often on my radio program, but I speak about it even more so as the head of Civic Action, which is, and I'm really heartened, by the way, that some of the Liberal leadership candidates, in response to a letter we sent them asking them a direct question about revenue raising to pay for this transit that Leslie talked about, actually said, and it's the first time they have, they never did when they were part of the McGuinty government in the last number of years because it wasn't politically sort of correct to say so, but 2 or 3 of them, I'll just go from memory, Eric Hoskins did, Kathleen Wynne did, Sandra Cubotello did, and so did Gerard Kennedy, said we have to use these revenue tools that provide a sustainable source of funding to build and operate this transit. And by the way, it's build and operate, because in the end, transit systems, by definition, virtually have operating losses. And this is something where honesty has not been the order of the day. And by that I don't mean to say that people have been telling lies, but it's that they're afraid to talk about the truth as to what's needed. And this is where I want to make my own second confession. When I ran for mayor in 2003, and it quickly sort of evolved to the point where by summer, I guess David Miller and I somehow emerged, even though both of us started completely unknown, as the 2 front-running contenders. And one day he mused about road tolls. And I don't happen to think road tolls are the best answer, but of all the sort of tools that are available. But I will say, and have said consistently, that we need to use some combination of tools to raise this money. But when he suggested road tolls, I challenged him in a debate on television, on City TV that night, and said, you, sir, say right here and right now, you will renounce any support you have for road tolls. You will promise never, ever to bring in road tolls. This is an awful thing you've done, sir. It's terrible. You should recant right now. And we even had people dressed up as highway robbers out in front of the debate with masks on, saying David Miller was going to highway rob. Well, you know what? That's how politicians act. And I was a politician then for the first time running my first campaign, and that was a mistake. Because what it meant was, from the whole time that David Miller then was mayor, he could never again talk about road tolls or any other kind of tax, because he sort of promised he wouldn't. He did in that debate. He promised he'd never talk about it again. That night, what's he going to say on TV that night? He said, I promise I'll never talk about it again, and he never did. And you know what? So I performed a disservice at that time, and I did it for the same reasons oftentimes these things are done, for political reasons, because it seemed like a way to score a point on the guy I was competing with at the time. And it wasn't David Miller or me that lost. I ended up losing the mayoralty race, but it was the citizens that lost, because not that road tolls were the answer, but it kind of shut off a lot of that discussion. We got to start up that discussion. We got to start up that discussion. And the notion that there is somehow free transit out there is, as you know, not true. There is no such thing. And it's going to and the notion there's some pot of money sitting around in governments, plural, federal, provincial, or municipal, just waiting to be allocated to transit, not true. You can see they all have their financial problems. So if we want to build the transit, for all the reasons stated by Leslie and myself, then we've got to have that honest discussion. And that's where I think you come in, is to sort of press our leaders to have some courage to have the discussion. And I was so heartened by the Liberal leadership candidates, because for the first time, I think they've recognized in a public way, all of them trying to become the next Premier of Ontario, yes, we have to have that sustainable funding model. We have to have those tools, whatever they might be. In Los Angeles, they used a sales tax. Other places, they've used other things. As Leslie said, there is no one model. But there is the need for the courage to actually stand up and make that decision. I want to make this one final point. I'm a great believer in the involvement and the productive and positive involvement of the private sector in all of this. There is hardly a public sector project that's being built today without the use of private money, whether it's hospitals or universities or whatever. However, if you want to talk about an area where I think there are people that are being dishonest right now, it is on this notion that they answer the question of how are we going to pay for transit, whether it's subways or LRTs. I don't concern myself much with that. I just think we should be building transit and some roadways as well. But when they say, well, don't worry, it can all be done with private money, you all know, frankly, that's bullshit. And no, but it is. It's bullshit for two reasons. If you want to use all private money, that's fine, but then you have to be prepared to open your mind to the fact that you're going to say to somebody, fine, if you want to build it with private money, then what are you going to get in return? And if they say, well, fine, we'll own it, and we'll operate it, and we'll keep the profits, and we'll make a profit on it, that may be an acceptable answer to some people, in which case we may say, well, that's better than not having it. But the notion that there's free transit is crazy, and if the private sector is going to build it with their money, and not taxpayers' money, well then, obviously you'll have to give something in return. Or, you accept the fact and be honest about it, you're just borrowing the money from the private sector, in which case, guess what? Like all the other money we all borrow for our mortgages and everything else, it has to be paid back. So you come right back to the same question, which is what revenue tools are you going to use to raise the money to pay back the private sector? And I don't care whether it's saying to developers you can build a condo above a subway station but you pay the cost of building the subway downstairs, or whether it's you say that we're going to have income tax increases or sales taxes, or I mean there's a menu that Metrolinx has put one out, Civic Action's put one out, the Board of Trade's put one out. It doesn't change much. There's about 15 items on it. None of them are painless for people. But if we want the transit, if we want to have a great city that is livable, if we want to give people access to economic opportunity that are living in some of the priority neighborhoods, if we want to keep the environment the way it should be, and have the kind of city we can be proud of, well then, we got to suck it up and have that discussion. And that's where you come in, I think, to say to people, you either have the courage to be candid about this, and be honest about this, and have the discussion and make some decisions on it, or we'll find some people who can't. Because in the end, we can't go on this way. Simply put, we can't go on this way. I mean, this is a great city, and we're letting it down by failing to make these decisions and getting on with building some of this transit.
Right on.
So there we go.